let me call upon our first speaker for the track one. We have the first topic to be automated testing of GraphQL APIs. Unmesh is a technology-focused IT professional with a rich, vast experience in leveraging software engineering, agile software development, test automation, and DevOps methodologies. He's also an author and technical reviewer on multiple books and technologies like Selenium and Appium. He has been with us even before, and he is very powerful speaker. I'm very glad to have you with us, Unmesh. Over to you.
Hey, thanks, Dipti. Let me share my screen. All right. Okay, so thanks, Dipti, for a generous introduction, and I'm really glad to be part of API Testing Summit 2021. I would like to thank Pallavi and Aditya giving me this opportunity, and thanks everybody for joining this session. And I hope you're safe and sound in this pandemic time. I'll be talking about GraphQL and how we test GraphQLs using some of the popular testing tools. So this session is really one-on-one session, which means we'll look at GraphQL at an introductory or beginner's level, what GraphQL is and how it works, what are the important terms in GraphQL, and then we look at how we can test it, what are different options available to test GraphQL APIs, and then we'll play with some of these tools and I'll show you a quick demo about those. So GraphQL, or before I start with GraphQL, let's understand the history of API. So APIs are there for a long time, right? And starting from Corba to the latest specification, which is GPRC. So over the time, different API architecture styles have been, emerged in the software engineering world, and each of them, provide different patterns for standardizing the data exchange. Let's say, in 1990s, SOAP was the most popular API standard, and a lot of SOA, which is service-oriented architecture applications, were using SOAP. And then in 2000, REST architecture style was published, and then it got popular around that time. So the choices that we have today, they also raise endless debate, which architectural style is best and which should we use. I think, as the whole the software development paradigm evolves, these debates will happen and new styles will come. But today, many API consumers, they kind of refer REST as rest in peace, and they cheer for GraphQL, because GraphQL is kind of emerging as one of the popular standards for, at least for mobile development or microservices architecture. But that does not mean that GraphQL is the end. There is a GPRC also coming in. So today we'll mostly focus on the GraphQL, which is kind of gaining a lot of popularity amongst the developers because of the simplicity and the productivity that it offers for the front-end development community. So what is GraphQL? So GraphQL is a query language for API. You can think about a SQL language that we use for querying databases. It is similar to a query language that you can use for the API. And it was built by Facebook in 2012, and then it was open source in 2015. So why Facebook kind of created GraphQL? So back in 2012, the Facebook mobile app, was using the REST-based, API specification to kind of render the customer or user experience. And around that time, they were using, different API endpoints, REST API endpoints, to populate things like posts, likes, comments. So the app used to make so many API calls, and then they used to filter out, do aggregation, and then kind of render the UI with the data. And this kind of slowed down the performance of their application. If you remember, around 2012, the Facebook app was very slow and used to crash a lot. So the Facebook engineers kind of spent a lot of their time to figure out what's the best way to fetch the data and give a customer experience that is seamless. So the fetching data with multiple API calls kind of degraded the performance of their app, and that's where they started working on the new specification, which is GraphQL. So what GraphQL does is, instead of fetching the data, for each of the endpoint, it fetches data as a single, API call, and it gets you data that you need in your client, and then it avoids doing the multiple calls to the APIs, and the GraphQL has a single endpoint, and it makes a single call and gets the data. So let's see how it works in reality. So the GraphQL, as I said, it's a query language for APIs, and for that you also need to describe your data. You need to tell what your data is, what are the fields, and what are the types that this field has, what are the relations, and things like that. And when you do that, when you query the data, you have to tell what you really need from your backend, and then you define that in a query. And that's what we call is ask for what you want, and then you get a predictable result from based on the query that you have made through the GraphQL client. So the client, the GraphQL offers client a power to ask exactly what they need and nothing more, and then you kind of avoid making multiple calls, aggregating data, filtering data, and then just showing the data that is makes sense to the user. So instead of doing all those operations on the client side, you just specify within your in GraphQL query what exactly you need, and then it does all the things behind the scenes. So a quick example here about REST versus GraphQL. So again, I'll go back to the same example from the Facebook, where you can see there are different REST endpoints being called to get the user ID, then get his post, again for that post get the likes and the comments, right? Instead of making those 4 or 5 calls in the GraphQL, you're making a single call, and then you're asking for the user ID, what are the posts, what are the likes for those posts, and what are the comments. And you can also limit how many comments that you want to get, and then you can use that data and bind that to your user interface or your mobile app or your front end. So what is the difference between REST API and GraphQL API? So architecturally, the REST API is server driven, and a server decides, like it provides you different endpoints, and it will based on those endpoints it will return the data. Whereas the GraphQL, it is client driven, and it uses schemas and types. So client tells what data that they want, what schema and data types, that based on that they request the GraphQL server what data they want, and then GraphQL server will return that data. The format that today is supported by REST, REST supports different types of formats, XML, JSON, plain text as well. GraphQL today supports JSON. The current standard supports JSON. The GraphQL also is a self-documenting, and we'll see that in shortly. When you define the schema, GraphQL smartly creates a documentation for you, and it shows in a playground. In terms of the learning curve, while REST is easy to understand, GraphQL has few more nitty-gritties, and you need to there is a slight learning curve when you want to use all the features of GraphQL. While in terms of community and adoption, REST is widely adopted, and there is a large user community. GraphQL has the community is growing. REST, especially when we have APIs, let's say I developed an API a year back, and I made the change, and I added new field. In REST, we have to create the versions, because the clients may break when there are changes in the API, and then basically you create a version 1 for your old clients, version 2 for your new clients, and so on. In GraphQL, there is no need for versioning, so you can deprecate the types without breaking the client, and whether it's an old user or old client or it's a new client, they can still use the API without using any versioning. And the use cases are like, REST is largely all public APIs or resource-driven APIs are built with REST. However, the GraphQL APIs are largely used for mobile front ends or web front ends, and in complex and microservices architecture. So GraphQL has been pretty popular within the microservices architecture to basically serve the front ends. So quickly on the benefits, again, I covered most of it in my earlier slides, but the major benefit that GraphQL offers is, it is a great fit for complex systems and microservices. It does, get the data fetching in single API call, so we don't have a issue of over or under fetching on performance issues related to that. And you can tailor the request that you need. You can ask the data that you need, and using the GraphQL features for filtering and aggregations. Also, you do a lot of validation and type checking, which happens out of the box with GraphQL. It auto-generates the documentation, and there is no versioning and code sharing. So how does GraphQL work? So we'll see also with an app. So let's say there is a client, and it's a mobile app which is asking for data, and what it does is it queries the GraphQL server, and GraphQL server has something called resolvers. So resolvers are which will these are the functions that will fetch the data based on the models or the schema that is defined. So for example, I have users and posts as my models, and there is a schema defined. Based on that, the resolver will fetch the data from database, and these databases could be a SQL database, could be MongoDB database, or mix of databases. The resolvers use connectors based on the database, and they will fetch the data from different databases, and they will serve the request back to the client. And we'll see shortly with a simple app that I have how this works. So some terms in GraphQL is about. Well, let's start with the schema and type. So what is schema? The schema is it's like defining a database table, right? You define your database table, you provide the column and the data types of those columns, right? So you define the schema for your model as well as for your queries or for your mutations. So we'll see queries and mutations shortly. So you define what that means in your GraphQL server, and this is a contract that will that will happen between the client and the server. And each object has to be specific type. It has to have a number of fields, and field can have different types of data type like string, int, float, or boolean. And the exclamation mark denotes the field is mandatory or non-nullable. So this is a sample schema that we'll see later in the demo. And you can see that there is a query type, there is an auth type, and there is a book type. So it's a small application that returns authors and books and then their ratings. So what is queries and mutations? Okay, so queries are which will get you data, and mutations will change your data. So queries are used to request the data from the server. So unlike REST, where there are defined structure and there are multiple endpoints, GraphQL always exposes you one endpoint. It allows it will give one endpoint, and we'll see that. And using the query syntax, we can decide what data we want, and using that endpoint, we can fetch the data from the server. Whereas mutation is used to modify the data on the server, and the mutations are like equivalent to the create, update, or delete operations. In REST API, we use HTTP verbs for create, update, delete. In GraphQL, we have mutation, which will do similar CUD operations, but without using these forms, and it will use the same endpoint to perform these operations. So queries. So let's start with how queries and mutations look. So queries at the simplest, is asking what you want, the fields on the objects. And let's say with the schema that we saw, it basically provides you a list of authors and their books. So here I have a query which says query author's name. This will return me, all the authors that are there in my database and their name. Now let's make it a little more complex. So here, let's say I want to return all the authors or the author, which is with an ID, and then I want to list his name and his books. When I run this query, it will return the data in JSON format, and it will tell, let's say, it's my books only. So the name of the author and the books that I have written. Mutation will create a new record in the database, and the mutations are written like this. So you have mutation, then you have to tell what that mutation is. So it's create author, and then you have to provide the data that is required to create the author. So in this case, we just need the name property for the create author. So it will create the record in the database, and then it will return the ID and name back to us. The last important concept is subscription. So the subscriptions, it allows clients to listen to real-time messages from the server, and the client connects to the server with a bi-directional communication channel. Let's say you are using WebSocket and you send a subscription query. Whenever there is an update on the server and that event is triggered, the server will return back you with the latest result to the client using the same communication channel. So this is another powerful feature where let's say you have a query, and let's say you're creating an account in a mobile banking application, and when the creation happens, there are so many things, events are triggered, and as the events are completed, your mobile app will send you notifications that your account is created, your credit card is created, your credit card is dispatched, and things like that. So it's again very powerful feature that you will see in some of the latest mobile banking applications. Using GraphQL. You would see all these notifications coming in. Now, quickly going back to testing GraphQL. So testing GraphQL is pretty much same as testing REST APIs, and there are so many choices for you to automate. Use the tools to first test manually and then automate. I just listed down some of the popular ones like Curl or Postman. You have Rest Assured, you have SuperTest in Node.js, or REST Sharp in .NET. And you can use any GraphQL client and a testing framework like Jest or Mocha or JUnit, and you can automate the test. So there are choices, and you can select what's best based on the technology that you are using, and the one that you are familiar with, to use that tool. So let's hit the demo, and we'll see the GraphQL, the server and the client running. So let me switch to another screen. So this is a demo application that I have, and as I said, there is a schema that is created. It basically has a list of authors and the books that those authors have written, and there are some fields like title, published, the publication year, link, rating, and the link to the author, right? And then we also have some queries defined here. So I can query authors, I can query a particular author, or I can query a book. And we can add more and different queries and pagination and things like that. At the moment, I've kept it very simple for this demo. And then we also have one mutation, which will create an author back into database when we call this mutation. I talked about the resolver function. So the resolver functions are kind of associated with your schema, and they will provide you the ability to query the database, actual database, which is MongoDB that is running behind this application. And using the Mongo client, they will provide you ability to query the database or create the new record in database. I have usual database client which is configured to run the MongoDB and Express.js, which will kind of serve the GraphQL endpoint or this API endpoint for my front end application. Now, when we run this, one benefit or one feature of GraphQL is when we run this application, the GraphQL will provide you a playground or a kind of a UI through which you can try out your GraphQL, your API. So by default, all the GraphQL projects, they will load you the something like this, and in this UI you can query your GraphQL API. You can create mutations and things like that. I also talk about the automated auto documentation with GraphQL. So when we run this project, this project is running now, and then it automatically gave me the playground. If you look at the documentation part options or section, it will tell me what are the different queries that I can run and what is the data that I can request. And it will also tell me what are the mutations that are available. And this is what we call a self-documentation feature. It will also tell us the schema. What is the schema that is is used for this GraphQL API? So you don't have to configure anything. The GraphQL client or the Node.js package that I'm using, it will automatically generate this documentation. Now, how query happens? So let's try out some queries, a simple query, and get the list of all the authors. And you can see that as I start typing, it also intelligently tell me what are the schemas or what are the types that are available to query. So let's say authors, and then we'll say get me names of the authors. Okay, and then when I run this query, it will return me the list of authors and the name. And I can expand this further, and I can say books. And I'll say the name of books that they have written, and then it will there's no name property, there's a title, and it will return me all the books and the title of those books written by each of these authors, right? So if you are testing GraphQL manually, in the beginning, you can use this your playground, and you can play with the API, and then start inspecting the GraphQL API to design your test cases. You can also, this is the simplest query, but let's say you want to do some filtering as well. I want an author whose ID is 1. I can do that. I can do a filtering here, and then it will return me the record that has the ID 1 and the related information about that. Right? We can do lots of things, like we can create query variables. So, for example, I want to pass this externally. Instead of hard coding this value, I want to use different variable here or different values. So I can say ID.
Hi, Unmesh. Sorry to interrupt. We have a few, relative queries coming in. There is a query that the queries you have written are post calls. If so, why and how?
Yeah. So everything in GraphQL is post. Unlike the REST API, all the queries that the GraphQL endpoint, the query or the mutation that we do, they are the post calls, and that's how the GraphQL is designed.
Great. Also, a related question: what is the use of creating mutations?
So the use of mutation is to create the records back into database or the update the records in database. So like in REST API, you have the get call to get the data. But let's say you want to create a new record or update the record, you will use post and put. The mutation is similar to post or put or delete. The mutation will change the record back in your database or in your backend.
Okay, thank you. You can continue, Unmesh. I think we have another 4 minutes.
Okay. So how much time remaining? I'll quickly cover the rest of it.
4 minutes. 4 more minutes.
Okay. Okay. All right. So let's quickly move on to Postman and see how things work here. So probably let me do one thing. So in Post, the first tool that we can look at is a Postman, and Postman offers you to query the GraphQL. If you see, there is an option called GraphQL, and this is the URL through which you can access the GraphQL backend. And as I said, there is only one verb, that is post verb, that is used, and we can use the GraphQL option here and query the data from Postman. So let's say the similar option that the query that I was doing. Let me do quickly. Let's say. And I'll say name. All right. So if I run this, it will perform the same operation or the same result that our playground returns. So it basically returns me the names of the authors and in an array. We can also add some tests here. So simplest test is to check whether it returns 200, because GraphQL will either return 200 or 400. 200 is for success, but it can also have an exception coming from the backend. And 400 is something that GraphQL server, it doesn't like the response, or it doesn't like the request, it will return 400. So let me quickly add one more test case here. I have something in my Scratchpad. Let's say I want to check whether the values that are returned are as per the expectation. I can do that in here. So we'll just inspect the values and we'll make sure that everything looks good from the data that is coming back from the server. And once we run the test, it will show you that status code is 200 and the author name. So we can do lots of other things. With respect to the time, I think I'll move on. All the code and examples are available in GitHub repository that you can look. So coming back to creating automated tests. So I have used SuperTest for this example, and SuperTest is a Node.js testing framework, and I use Jest as a test runner. And using SuperTest and Jest, you can create some really simple test cases for your GraphQL backend. For example, this is a similar test case for fetching the author. We basically make a post call. We send a query that we want the list of authors. We set the headers and the what is the expected content type and the status code, and then we query. We send a request and we validate the values that are returned by the GraphQL backend. Similarly, we have fetch a particular author and we say it is the correct record. We can also test let's say this is a query. This is not yet implemented in the backend, and then it should return error. And in this case, it is returning 400. similar to Mutation, you can also run the test around your mutation. So let's say I want to run a mutation, create a new author, and check whether the author is created, and then I can do that. So I have used, as I said, SuperTest and the Jest, and they offer all the matches and expectation. The validation methods for you. So that's pretty much. So I have this GitHub repository where everything is configured. You can also look at the actions where we can run your Postman collection as your Newman CLI, or you can run the the tests which are written in Jest and SuperTest. That's pretty much.
Cool. Thanks, Unmesh.
Any questions?
Yeah, that's where I'm coming. We have one question. Can we get something without request body? In this case, like we get in REST by just passing a URL?
No. So the way GraphQL is designed, you have to define the schema, and there is kind of you define the strict checking as well. So it will always return you something based on the defined query and the schema.
Okay, cool. One last question. Can aggregations be used in the query? Like how many books are written by ID equals 1, something like that?
I think there are some advanced features in GraphQL. Again, there are different implementations, and I think that there is a way to do that. But again, you can also have your resolvers configured to do it better at the at the server side.
Cool. I think there were a couple of other basic questions like what is GraphQL and where it could be used. I think that got answered as in when Unmesh started taking us through the slides. Hope that is clear, Jyoti, and I don't know who this is, 3034. Okay. Cool. Thank you so much, Unmesh. That was a very informative one. I mean, thank you so much for taking us through the GraphQL new feature and new, I mean, the way you can create aggregations and do testing. Is my screen seen?
Not yet, Deepti.
Thanks, Deepti.
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, thank you so much. Dear audience, we will just add this link. Please feel free to give feedback for Unmesh session. And Unmesh, thank you so much for coming up with this, and thanks for joining us. We really had a great time. I have taken most of the questions which were there in the chat. Still, audience, if you would want to connect with him, if you have more questions, please connect with him on LinkedIn, or I think Unmesh also can answer it over the chat. Thank you so much, Unmesh.